In the heart of Millbrook, a typical mid-sized town in the American heartland, lived Eliza Johnson. At 26, Eliza embodied hope and determination. As an emergency room nurse at the local hospital, she spent her days saving lives, comforting the sick, and being the pillar her colleagues leaned on during difficult moments. That evening, like many others, Eliza was returning from a grueling 12-hour shift. Spring was in the air, bringing with it the promise of warmer, better days. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, Eliza was already thinking about the quiet dinner she would share with her partner, Marcus, and maybe a movie before falling into a well-deserved sleep. Eliza and Marcus's apartment was modest but welcoming. Family photos adorned the walls, testifying to a life filled with love and laughter. On a shelf, Eliza's diploma stood proudly, the fruit of years of hard study and sacrifice. "Good evening, honey," Marcus said, greeting her with a kiss. "How was your day?" Eliza sighed, dropping her bag. "Busy as usual, but we managed to stabilize a patient who came in critical condition. It's for moments like these that I do this job." Marcus smiled, admiring his partner's passion for her work. "You're amazing, you know that? Come on, sit down. I've prepared your favorite dish." They sat down to dinner, discussing their day and their plans for the future. Eliza dreamed of one day becoming head nurse, while Marcus, a talented mechanic, hoped to open his own garage. Their conversation was punctuated with laughter and tender looks, the very picture of a young couple in love and full of hope. Meanwhile, a few miles away, in the Millbrook Police Department headquarters, a tense meeting was being held. Lieutenant James Carter was briefing his team for an operation planned for that night. "Listen up," Carter said, his serious face illuminated by the harsh light of the briefing room. "We've received information that a major drug operation is taking place in the Pine Street apartment complex. Our main target is a man named David Thompson, known as Big D on the streets." He pointed to a photo on the board. "Thompson is dangerous and likely armed. We have a search warrant for apartment 4B. The operation needs to be quick and discreet. We don't want to give him a chance to destroy evidence or escape." Officer Sarah Martinez raised her hand. "Lieutenant, do we have any recent information on who else might be in the apartment?" Carter shook his head. "Our information is limited. That's why we need to be extremely careful. Wear your bulletproof vests and be ready for anything." What Carter didn't know was that their information was tragically outdated. David Thompson had moved out of apartment 4B 3 months ago. The apartment was now occupied by Eliza and Marcus, who had no connection to Thompson's criminal activities. As the night progressed, Eliza and Marcus prepared for bed. Eliza had another long day ahead of her tomorrow, and she wanted to be well-rested. "You know," Marcus said, turning off the bedside lamp, "I was thinking maybe we could start looking for a house. Something with a small garden, where we could watch our kids grow up." Eliza smiled in the darkness. "I'd love that. Maybe next year, when I get my promotion." They fell asleep, unaware that their peaceful life was about to be brutally interrupted. Around midnight, the SWAT team positioned themselves around the building. Lieutenant Carter gave the signal, and the officers rushed towards apartment 4B. The deafening sound of the door being forced open startled Eliza and Marcus awake. Disoriented and terrified, they heard heavy footsteps in their living room. "Police! Nobody move!" a voice shouted. Marcus, acting on instinct to protect Eliza, grabbed the gun he kept in the nightstand drawer. "Who's there?" he yelled, his voice trembling. The events that followed unfolded in a matter of seconds, but their consequences would last an eternity. Marcus, thinking they were victims of a burglary, fired a warning shot. The officers, believing they were under attack, immediately returned fire. A hail of bullets tore through the apartment. Eliza, who had gotten up to try to understand what was happening, was hit multiple times. She collapsed to the floor, her blood quickly spreading across the carpet they had bought together just a few months earlier. "Eliza!" Marcus screamed, rushing towards her. But before he could reach her, he was tackled to the ground by 2 officers. When the gunfire finally ceased, a deafening silence filled the apartment. Lieutenant Carter, slowly realizing the magnitude of the catastrophe, ordered his men to lower their weapons. "Call an ambulance," he shouted, kneeling beside Eliza. But as he checked for a pulse, he knew it was too late. Eliza Johnson, devoted nurse and generous soul, was dead in her own apartment, the victim of a terrible mistake. The hours that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The sirens of ambulances and police cars filled the night. Neighbors, awakened by the noise, watched with horror and confusion from their windows. Marcus, handcuffed and in shock, was taken to the police station for questioning. He kept repeating, "Why? Why did you do this? She was a nurse. She saved lives." The next morning, news of Eliza's death spread like wildfire through Millbrook. The community was in shock. How could a police operation have gone so terribly wrong? Eliza's parents, Robert and Maria Johnson, were awakened by a knock on their door in the early hours of the morning. When they saw two police officers at their door, their world crumbled. "No," Maria whispered, collapsing into her husband's arms. "Not our little girl. Not Eliza." Robert, struggling to keep his composure, demanded explanations. The officers, visibly uncomfortable, gave them a brief account of what had happened. "There was a mistake," one of them said. "We thought the apartment was occupied by a drug dealer." "A mistake!" Robert exclaimed, his voice rising with anger and grief. "You killed our daughter because of a mistake?" In the days that followed, the town of Millbrook was shaken by a wave of anger and sorrow. Candlelight vigils were held outside the hospital where Eliza had worked. Her colleagues, patients, and friends gathered to mourn the loss of a woman who had touched so many lives. Millbrook Police Chief John Anderson held a hasty press conference to try to explain the situation. "We understand the community's anger and sadness," he said, his face tense and tired. "A thorough investigation is underway to understand how this tragedy could have occurred. We will fully cooperate with external investigators to ensure complete transparency." But his words rang hollow for many. Protests began to form outside the police station, demanding justice for Eliza and reform of the police department. Marcus, released after intense questioning, was devastated. He spent days sitting in their apartment, looking at pictures of Eliza, unable to comprehend how their life could have changed so brutally. It was the visit of Eliza's sister, Sophia, that brought him out of his stupor. "Eliza wouldn't have wanted you to give up," Sophia said, her eyes red from crying. "She would have wanted us to fight for justice, not just for her, but to make sure this never happens to anyone else." These words were like an electric shock to Marcus. He realized he had a role to play in this fight for justice. With the help of Sophia and Eliza's parents, Marcus contacted Benjamin Harris, a renowned lawyer specializing in police brutality cases. Harris, after listening to their story, immediately agreed to take the case. "What happened to Eliza is a tragedy that should never have occurred," he said. "We're not only going to seek justice for her, but also push for systemic changes that will prevent this from happening again." Meanwhile, the police's internal investigation revealed a series of errors and negligence that had led to Eliza's death. The search warrant had been obtained based on outdated information. The officers had not properly verified the address before the raid. And most importantly, they had not followed standard identification procedures before forcibly entering the apartment. These revelations only fueled the community's anger. Larger protests began to form, not only in Millbrook but in neighboring towns as well. People wore T-shirts and carried signs with Eliza's face and the slogan "Justice for Eliza." Eliza's story began to attract national attention. Journalists from major news networks arrived in Millbrook, turning this local tragedy into a national debate on police reform and law enforcement accountability. Celebrities and politicians began to speak out about the case. A popular singer tweeted, "Eliza Johnson saved lives. She deserved to live. We must change a system that allows such deadly mistakes to happen. #Justice for Eliza." The state senator made a statement calling for a federal investigation into the incident and a complete review of police practices. As the case gained momentum, Eliza's family, guided by lawyer Harris, filed a lawsuit against the Millbrook Police Department and the city. Their complaint alleged gross negligence, violation of constitutional rights, and excessive use of force. The trial quickly became the focal point of national attention. Each day, the courtroom was filled with journalists, activists, and concerned citizens. Marcus's testimony was particularly poignant. He recounted in detail the events of that fateful night, his voice often breaking as he described how he had seen Eliza fall. "We thought they were burglars," he said, tears in his eyes. "No one identified themselves as police. One moment we were sleeping peacefully, and the next, our world was crumbling." The officers involved in the raid also testified. Many expressed remorse but maintained that they had followed the procedures they had been taught. Lieutenant Carter, visibly shaken, admitted to errors in planning the raid. "We should have checked the information more carefully," he said. "I will carry the weight of this mistake for the rest of my life." As the weeks went by, the trial revealed deep systemic flaws in the Millbrook Police Department. Inadequate training practices, lack of supervision, and a culture that prioritized spectacular arrests over public safety were brought to light. Parallel to the trial, the movement for justice for Eliza continued to grow. Peaceful marches were organized every week, attracting thousands of people from all walks of life. Protesters demanded not only justice for Eliza but also profound reforms in police practices. The medical community also mobilized. Eliza's colleagues organized silent sit-ins in front of the hospital, wearing their white coats in tribute to their fallen friend. The hospital director made a powerful statement. "Eliza Johnson represented the best of our profession. Her loss is a tragedy not only for her family and friends, but for all the patients she could have helped in the years to come." After weeks of testimony and deliberations, the jury reached its verdict. The Millbrook Police Department and the city were found responsible for Eliza's death. The jury awarded the family substantial financial compensation, but more importantly, the verdict demanded significant changes in police practices. The judge, in his final statement, said, "This case has exposed serious flaws in our law enforcement system. It is our duty to ensure that Eliza Johnson's death leads to meaningful change." The verdict included several mandates for reform: mandatory de-escalation training for all police officers, a review and overhaul of procedures for obtaining and executing search warrants, implementation of a community oversight board for the police department, mandatory use of body cameras for all officers during any interaction with the public, a complete review and reform of the department's use of force policies. While the verdict brought a sense of relief to Eliza's family and supporters, they knew that their fight was far from over. The real challenge would be ensuring that these changes were implemented and that they made a real difference. In the months that followed, Millbrook became a focal point for national discussions on police reform. Experts, activists, and policymakers visited the town, studying the changes being implemented and their effects. Marcus, who had once been a quiet mechanic, found himself thrust into the role of an activist. He spoke at conferences, gave interviews, and worked tirelessly to keep Eliza's memory alive and to push for continued reform. Eliza dedicated her life to helping others. He would often say in his speeches, "The best way we can honor her memory is by making sure that what happened to her never happens to anyone else." The Millbrook Police Department, under intense scrutiny, began to implement the mandated changes. New training programs were developed, focusing on de-escalation techniques and implicit bias awareness. The Community Oversight Board was established, giving citizens a voice in police practices and policies. However, change did not come easily. Some officers resisted the new measures, arguing that they made their jobs more difficult and dangerous. There were heated debates in the town council meetings about the cost and extent of the reforms. But the supporters of change, bolstered by Eliza's story, remained determined. They organized community meetings, worked with the police to build trust, and kept the pressure on local officials to follow through on their commitments. 1 year after Eliza's death, the town held a memorial service. Hundreds gathered in the park where Eliza used to jog every morning. Speeches were given, songs were sung, and candles were lit in her memory. Robert Johnson, Eliza's father, spoke at the event. His voice, filled with emotion, carried across the silent crowd. "A year ago, We lost our beautiful daughter. Eliza was a healer, a caregiver, a bright light in this world. Her death left a hole in our hearts that will never fully heal. But standing here today, seeing all of you, I feel hope. Hope that her death was not in vain. Hope that we can build a better, safer community for everyone. Eliza would have wanted that, as the candlelight flickered in the evening breeze, there was a sense of unity and purpose among the gathered crowd. Eliza's tragic death had brought the community together in a way that few could have imagined. The changes in Millbrook began to show results. In the year following the implementation of reforms, complaints against the police department decreased by 40%. The use of force incidents dropped significantly, and community satisfaction with police interactions improved. Other towns and cities began to take notice. Delegations visited Millbrook to study their reform model, and soon, similar changes were being implemented in police departments across the state. The story of Eliza Johnson and the Millbrook reforms made it to the national stage. A documentary filmmaker came to town to chronicle the changes, interviewing Marcus, the Johnsons, police officers, and community members. The resulting film, titled For Eliza, A Town's Fight for Justice, premiered at a major film festival and went on to win several awards. It brought Eliza's story and the issue of police reform to an even wider audience. 2 years after Eliza's death, the governor signed into law the Eliza Johnson Police Accountability Act. The act mandated many of the reforms first implemented in Millbrook for all police departments across the state. It was a bittersweet moment for Marcus and the Johnson family, a recognition that Eliza's death had led to meaningful change, but also a painful reminder of their loss. At the signing ceremony, Maria Johnson, Eliza's mother, was invited to speak. With tears in her eyes but strength in her voice, she addressed the gathered officials and press. My daughter Eliza believed in helping others. Every day, she went to work with the goal of saving lives and easing suffering. She should have had a long career ahead of her, touching countless lives. Instead, her life was cut short by a system that failed her. But today, as we sign this act into law, I feel that Eliza is still helping others. Through these changes, she will continue to save lives. Let us honor her memory by ensuring that these reforms are not just words on paper, but real changes that make our communities safer for everyone. The journey towards justice and reform was far from over. There would be more challenges, more resistance, and more work to be done. But the story of Eliza Johnson had become a rallying cry, a reminder of the human cost of a flawed system and the power of a community united for change. As Marcus walked home from the signing ceremony, he passed by the hospital where Eliza had worked. A mural had been painted on one of the walls, showing Eliza in her nurse's uniform. Surrounded by the words, compassion, justice, and change, he stopped for a moment, looking at the image of the woman he had loved, the woman whose death had sparked a movement. He thought about all that had happened in the past 2 years. The pain, the anger, the struggles, but also the unity, the determination, and the changes that were slowly but surely making a difference. He thought about the lives that would be saved because of the reforms, the families that would be spared the pain that he and the Johnsons had endured. Marcus touched the mural gently, his fingers tracing Eliza's painted smile. We're doing it, Eliza, he whispered. We're making a difference. I hope you'd be proud. As he turned to leave, he saw a young police officer standing nearby, looking at the mural. Their eyes met, and the officer nodded respectfully. It was a small gesture, but it represented so much: acknowledgement, understanding, and a shared commitment to do better. Marcus nodded back and continued on his way home. The sun was setting over Millbrook, casting a warm glow over the town. It was not the same place it had been 2 years ago. It had been changed, challenged, and ultimately strengthened by tragedy and the pursuit of justice. As Marcus walked, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The nights of despair, the days filled with anger and grief, the countless meetings and protests, the grueling trial, all of it had led to this moment of change. But he knew that the work was far from over. The Eliza Johnson Police Accountability Act was a significant step forward, but laws alone couldn't change hearts and minds. The real work of reform would happen in the day-to-day interactions between police and the community, in the training rooms where officers learned new approaches, and in the conversations that were now happening in homes and businesses across Millbrook and beyond. Marcus thought about the community oversight board he now sat on. It hadn't been easy, sitting across the table from officers, some of whom had been involved in the raid that took Eliza's life. But slowly, painfully, they were building understanding and trust. They were learning to see each other as human beings, all wanting the same thing, a safe and just community. He remembered a recent meeting where a young officer had spoken up. "I became a cop to help people," she had said, her voice trembling slightly. "What happened to Eliza Johnson? It made me question everything. But being part of these changes, working with the community, it's reminded me why I chose this path. We can do better. We have to do better." Those words had stuck with Marcus. They were a reminder that change was possible, that even in the face of tragedy, there was hope for a better future. As he neared his apartment building, Marcus saw his neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, tending to her small garden. She waved to him, a warm smile on her face. It was a simple gesture, but it meant so much. In the days following Eliza's death, when the press had swarmed their building and tensions in the community were at their highest, Mrs. Rodriguez had been there with home-cooked meals and a shoulder to cry on. "How did it go today, Marcus?" she called out. "It went well," he replied, managing a small smile. "The act was signed into law." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "Eliza would be proud. You've done good, hijo." Marcus felt a lump in his throat. "Thank you," he said softly, "for everything." As he entered his apartment, memories of Eliza flooded back, as they often did. Her laugh echoing through the rooms, the smell of her favorite jasmine candles, the sight of her curled up on the couch with a medical journal. The pain of her loss was still there, a constant ache in his heart, but it was accompanied now by a sense of purpose. He went to the small desk in the corner of the living room, where he had set up a kind of memorial to Eliza. Her nursing diploma hung on the wall, surrounded by photos of her, smiling with patience, celebrating with colleagues, laughing with friends and family. Next to these was a framed copy of the Eliza Johnson Police Accountability Act. Marcus sat down at the desk and opened his laptop. He had promised to write a blog post about the day's events for the Justice for Eliza website. As he began to type, he felt a renewed sense of determination. He wrote about the signing ceremony, about the speech Maria Johnson had given, and about the changes that were already happening in Millbrook. He wrote about the challenges that still lay ahead and the need for continued vigilance and activism. As he neared the end of his post, he paused, thinking carefully about his closing words. Finally, he typed, "Today marks a significant step forward in our fight for justice and accountability. The Eliza Johnson Police Accountability Act is more than just a law, it's a promise. A promise to Eliza, to every victim of police brutality, and to every community that has lived in fear rather than trust of those sworn to protect them. But this is not the end of our journey. It's a beginning. The real work starts now, in our police departments, in our communities, and in our hearts. We must continue to push for change, to hold our leaders and our law enforcement accountable, and to build the kind of society where tragedies like what happened to Eliza never occur again." Eliza dedicated her life to helping others, to healing and protecting. In her memory, we must continue this work. We must be the change we want to see in the world. Tonight, as I think about Eliza and all we've accomplished in her name, I'm filled with a mix of sorrow and hope. Sorrow for the life that was lost, for the future that was stolen. But hope for the changes we're making, for the lives that will be saved, for the communities that will be transformed. To everyone who has supported this cause, who has marched, spoken out, and demanded change, thank you. And to those who are just learning about Eliza's story, join us. Be part of this change. Together, we can build a world of justice, compassion, and true community safety. For Eliza, for all of us, Marcus read over his words, made a few small edits, and then hit publish. As the post went live, he leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. It had been a long day, the culmination of 2 years of relentless work and emotional turmoil. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the Millbrook skyline. The town looked peaceful in the fading light, but he knew that beneath the surface, it was a community still healing, still changing, still striving to be better. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Marcus made a silent promise to Eliza, to himself, and to the community he now fought for. He would continue this work, no matter how long it took, no matter how difficult it became, because every life saved, every injustice prevented, every positive change made, that was Eliza's legacy. And he would make sure it was a legacy that endured. With renewed determination, Marcus turned from the window and began to plan for tomorrow. There was still so much work to be done, but for the first time in a long time, the future looked a little brighter, a little more like the world Eliza had worked so hard to create. And in that moment, in the quiet of his apartment with Eliza's memory all around him, Marcus felt a sense of peace. They were making a difference. They were changing things. And somewhere he was sure Eliza was smiling.